Welcome again to Joan TV Media. It's always a pleasure to have you here with me. It is so heartbreaking to read about cruelty of slaves, but this information increases our historical knowledge. I hope when we gather the information, it makes us stronger because knowledge is power. As usual, I ask that you subscribe for other videos, like, and share the knowledge. Big up the thing, enough respect. Slavery in Barbados. Slavery was a part of Barbados' life for centuries. Barbados was inhabited by the indigenous people, the Arawaks, and of course the Caribs. Leading up to the European colonization of the Americas in the 16th century, Barbados was briefly claimed by the Portuguese from 1532 to 1620. The island was a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy modeled on the Westminster system. A settlement was established as a proprietary colony and founded by Sir William Corten, a merchant from England who acquired the title to Barbados and several other islands. So the first colonists were tenants. Because of that, most of the profits of their labor returned to Corten and his company. The first English ship on Barbados was on May 14, 1625. The first settlement began in February 17, 1627, in Jamestown, now known as Old Town. Corten's title was transferred to James A., 1st Earl of Carlisle, in what was called the Great Barbados Robbery. By 1650, there were about 44,000 settlers in the West Indies as compared to 12,000 on the Chesapeake. Chesapeake colony were the colony and dominion of Virginia. Most English arrivals were indentured. After 5 years of labor, they were given freedom dues. Before the mid-60s, they were given free lands and about 5 to 10 acres. Around the time of Cromwell, a number of rebels and criminals were also transported to Barbados. Before this, the mainstay of the colony's economy was the growing export of tobacco, but it was priceless and collapsed in the 1630s as Chesapeake production expands. The cultivation of sugarcane began in 1640s after was introduced in 1637 by Peter Bloor. Initially, rum was produced, but by 1642 sugarcane was the focus of the industry. By the latter decades of the 17th century, sugar dominated the island, labor and exports. Barbadian planters used white British laborers as indentured servants to work on their farms in the middle of the 1600s and onward. Planters began to purchase even more enslaved workers to supplement and eventually work to replace indentured laborers. By the end of the century, Barbados' labor force was almost wholly enslaved. The practices and habits of the sugar cultivation and the enslaved labor in Barbados proved to be very influential elsewhere in the Americas. Powerful Barbadian planters were the first to settle in what would become the South Carolina, where they imported both plantation crops and slaves from Barbados. When the Dutch Brazil introduced sugarcane in 1640, it completely transformed the society and also the economy. Barbados eventually had one of the world's biggest sugar industries. As the efforts of the new crop increased, so did the shift in the ethnic composition of Barbados. The work of the plantations required a large investment and a great deal of heavy labor. At first, the Dutch trade supplied the equipped financing and the slaves, in addition to transporting most of the sugar to Europe. In 1644, the population of Barbados was estimated about 30,000, of which 800 were of African descent. The English smallholders were brought out and Barbados filled up with large African slave workers on the plantations. By 1666, at least 12,000 white smallholders was either bought, died, or left the island, so that left many of the remaining white very poor. By 1680, there were 17 slaves to every indentured servant. By the 17th century, there were 15,000 whites and 50,000 enslaved blacks. The implementation of the slave codes was increased, which shows differential treatment between Africans and the white workers that was in 1666 to 1688. In response to the code, several slaves rebellions were attempted, but none was successful. The poor whites who had the opportunity to migrate did so. Planters expanded their importation of African slaves to work on the sugar plantation. By 1660, Barbados generated more trade than all the other English colonies combined. Barbados was now divided into large sugar estates that replaced the small holdings of the early English settlers. On the plantations, the enslaved person did not spend all their time cultivating, harvesting, and processing sugarcane. Rather, they were involved in other activities like raising livestock, growing provisions, maintaining plantation infrastructures, and caregiving. Africans were given but one reason to live, that is to ensure that they serve the investors' wealth creation. Not only were the slaves deemed chattel, but laws also defined them as a real estate. In the Slaves Code protects masters from unruly slaves. In the slave code wasn't designed for slaves. It provided more protection for the masters themselves from the slaves. It requires masters to provide slaves with a set of clothing per year, but set no standard for slaves' diet, housing, or working conditions. It also denies slaves even of their basic rights, such as the right to life. It allows slaves owners to do whatever they wish to do with their slaves, including mutilating them and burning them alive, without fear of reprisal. Many cities in the slave trade require slave tag, that is a copper badge that the slave wore to show that they were allowed to move about. Most Africans showed their resistance through rebellion. A slave rebellion in Barbados, known as the Busa Rebellion, an African-born slave called Busa led a rebellion on Barbados. He was a free man born in Africa, but was taken to the Caribbean as a slave. He was a ranger at the Bailey Plantation in St. Philip's. He was a ranger there. Now a ranger was the head officer among the enslaved workers on the estate. He would have to take care of the day-to-day business between the estates. With his job, he got the opportunity to travel throughout the area. Busa planned the uprising with different slaves from other estates. The rebellion started on early Sunday night, April 4, 1816. It started at Bailey's estate. It was an attempt by the slaves to change the society on Barbados. They believed that Barbados belongs to them, and they also wanted their freedom from estate owners. The act to end the slave trade had been passed in Parliament in 1807. In 1815, the slaves thought they were going to have their freedom. When Governor Leith returned from Guadeloupe, they believed he was bringing a free paper to set them free. Busa commanded about 400 men and women against the troops. These include the West India Regiment, an all-black branch of the British Army. The rebellion broke out with cane fields being burnt in St. Philip's Parish in the central and southern parishes, that an indication that rebellion had begun. Over 70 estates were affected, forcing white owners and overseers to flee to Bridgetown in the colonial capital in panic. Despite the scope of the rebellion, only 2 whites were reported killed. By the time the soldiers had crushed the rebellion, a quarter of the island's sugarcane crops had gone up in flames. It was crushed by Marshall and British Imperial troops. 144 people had been executed. 70 were later sentenced to death, while 170 were deported to neighboring British colonies in the Caribbean. Alleged rebels were also subjected to flogging. Busa was killed in battle. Busa remained a popular figure in Barbados. In 1985, 169 years after the rebellion, the Emancipation Statue was unveiled in Agot Hall in the parish of St. Michael. In 1998, Barbados Parliament named Busa a national hero of Barbados. Thanks for taking the journey with me to Barbados. Hope you have learned something on your trip. See you soon.